Okie dokie. So here we are. Thanks for coming along, folks. This is number 2 for this year.
Yep.
So I think we've got 1 or 2 more sessions that we'll have before the year's out. As always, a chance to ask questions and talk about what yoga's about, other than just standing on your head or your hands or any of that sort of funny stuff. Does anyone have anything they would like to kick off with, or do you want me to start? I'll start then, apparently, as often happens. So just remember, if you've got questions, don't be afraid to ask. This is not meant to be a lecture. It's meant to be a chance for us to ask questions and have a discussion more than a one-way kind of talking to. But I thought I'd start off with, I wasn't sure coming into tonight what I was going to start with, but I got a haircut this afternoon. And the guy who normally cuts my hair's away on holiday, so I went across the road to the barber's just near Coles. It's the first time I've ever been there, so you sit down and there's the usual, sort of light chit chat of, what are you doing today? Have you got the day off work? No, I've just finished. Oh, what do you do? I'm a yoga teacher. I've actually got that yoga school across the road. And the guy said, I've never tried yoga. I really like watching it, like watching people do those handstands and stuff. Like, it's so cool, that amount of control. I just went, yeah. Takes a bit of practice. And so I guess that sort of gave me an idea of maybe tonight we'd start with a little bit of yoga myth busting. So the first myth busting is yoga about doing handstands? Absolutely not. It's not really about the postures at all. And so we've gotten to this point in the Western world where yoga is seen really as a form of exercise, hence the comment of, I like watching it, people doing handstands. But I think it's really important for us to remember that yoga started off, and I believe should always be taught as, we could say, a spiritual practice or a practice of self-inquiry. It's meant to help us answer the great question of human existence: who am I? What's the purpose of life? Or we could frame it in different ways, but ultimately yoga is a series of tools that allow us to answer that question for ourselves, to ask the question and then find our own answer to it. And so I think it's really important that we bear that in mind, that we can do fancy postures, great, but if we think the fancy postures actually mean anything, if we think they're actually going to give us something or give us any lasting benefit, we're kind of delusional. And that's about as bluntly as I can put it. It's said in all of the yoga texts that there's nothing external that can give us anything lasting. So no matter what experiences we have, no matter what job we have, no matter what friends we have, what relationships we have, what house we have, there's actually nothing outside of ourselves that can give us what we seek. And so it's really important to understand that the yoga asana practice is also something that, if we use it intelligently, will help us to answer that question of who am I? What's the purpose of life? But if we practice without intelligence or without wisdom really, then we tend to just see our yoga asana practice as another experience that comes and goes, and another way for us to fall into patterns of, I'm happy when I go and do my yoga practice. I'll be happy when I can do a handstand for 3 seconds. I'll be happy when I can do a proper back bend. I'll be happy when I can put my leg behind my head. We can say this in so many different ways. And it's the same pattern we fall into of, I'll be happy when I've got such and such a job, such and such a house, when I've got X amount of dollars in the bank. These are the patterns that we fall into through our upbringing, through the nature of our human existence. And if we're not careful, our yoga practice can simply become another one of those patterns of attachment to an experience that then causes dissatisfaction when we don't have that experience anymore. And I think that's really important for us to understand. I'm not saying, don't practice yoga asana, because it's wonderful for maintaining the vitality of the body, for moving energy through the body. But as some of you have heard me say before, there is no posture, no matter how complex, no matter how fancy, no matter how many years you devote to it, that is going to answer that question for you. That's going to give you the sense of wholeness that we actually all seek, and that we usually seek outwardly through experiences. So I guess that's yoga myth number one. Yoga is not about the postures. They're simply one of the tools that we use to help us to internalize, let's say, our focus, to start to pay attention to what's going on within our body, mind and heart. Because as I said, the yoga texts are all very, very clear that there's nothing outward that can give us anything that we seek, but we already possess within us everything that we need. So the answers to our questions are already within, but we usually are looking in the wrong direction. So whilst ever the mind and the senses are feeding outwardly, seeking satisfaction through something external, then they're not turned within to the source of both the question and the answer. So that's yoga myth number one. Yoga is not about the postures. Yoga myth number two, and I've mentioned this to you, some of you maybe once or twice before. A few years ago I was on a flight to Coffs Harbour. I was going to do a little workshop with a friend, Charlotte, in Bellingen. And it was a fairly short flight, and at the end of it, the guy I was sitting next to started, we sparked up a conversation. And he said, "What do you do?" I said, "I'm a yoga teacher." "Oh, my sister does yoga." And I was at her place the other day, and she was with her family making dinner, and the kids were mucking up, and she was, getting angry with them, yelling, and I turned to her and said, "Oh, that yoga's not working, is it? You're not very relaxed." Yoga myth number two. Yoga is not, or being a yoga practitioner, is not about always being chill. It's not about always being happy. It's not about always being calm. It's about always being present. And that's something I want you, again, some of you have heard me say this before, but I want you to take that on board, that part of the true practice of yoga is that we allow the experiences of life to come to us, and we aim to experience them fully and unreservedly. So in the times when we feel, let's say when some experience sparks happiness within us, we allow that experience of happiness to unfold fully without reservation. And then when that experience is gone, we're not holding on to it saying, "Oh, I wish such and such was still happening," or "I wish I was still in such and such a place," or whatever it may be. And at the same time, when the challenging situations of life arise, because in the duality of life, there is always a balance of good and bad, of happy and sad, of pleasant and unpleasant. The path of yoga teaches us to fully embrace those challenging, difficult times of sadness or frustration or anger. But again, once that moment of frustration or anger or sadness has passed, we let it go and we don't carry it with us. So we're not, worried about the same set of experiences happening at some point in the future. We're not holding on to our, we could say, negative emotions or challenging emotions and allowing them to limit us from experiencing the next moment in its fullness. Does that make sense? So we're not disengaging from life, but we're actually engaging with it more fully, but in a very real sense of presence. And some of you have heard me say that at the end of class when we're in Shavasana, just come back to pure presence, to here and now, to what's happening just in this moment. And it's said that, another way to express it is having the body and the mind in the same space at the same time. rather than our usual tendency to have the body in one place and the mind somewhere completely different. So we can say that's yoga myth number 2, that we're not supposed to be always relaxed, we're not supposed to be always happy, we're not supposed to be chilled. When there's times that call for frustration or anger, then we embrace that, but then when that experience passes, we let it go. And I can't remember who I was saying this to recently, but my teacher, or some of our teacher, Clive, who was here a few weeks ago, he is generally the most happy, smiley person you could ever wish to meet. But I've seen him angry, and let me tell you, you don't want to be on the receiving end of it. Because when he's angry, that anger is fully expressed. And, you know, almost to the point of rage. But then it's instantly gone when whatever sparked that that necessity in the moment for anger has passed, then the moment of the experience of the anger has passed as well, and he's back to just being happy, lovely, and very, very present. And so remember that in your yoga practice, that overall we could say that we might become calmer generally because we're not holding on to negative experiences of the past, or we're not afraid of, you know, challenging experiences that might unfold in the future, because of course the future is unknown, it's just an illusion in our mind. We should allow ourselves in the moments of frustration or anger or sadness to experience those emotions, and in the moments of joy and happiness we should also experience those fully and unreservedly, not holding back any of our joy because we think, oh, maybe I shouldn't, you know, laugh so loud, or maybe I shouldn't smile so much. So be present, living with each experience as it is. And there's an overall settling as our practice deepens to a place of deeper calm in the normality of life. And then there's the moments of fully experiencing all of our emotions, whatever they may be, and then simply letting them go, letting them dissolve into whatever the next moment may bring. Not the next hour, but each moment, each second, as it is. So yoga myth number 2. Yoga myth number 3, which some of you, I know we've talked about more one-on-one. I don't think we've ever talked about this in a group situation, or maybe not for a long time. There's 7 chakras in the body. Who knows that? Who's heard that or read that? Who knows? Who has no idea what a chakra is? So we're all cool with that term? Okay, it's a myth. It's a myth that's become very, very firmly entrenched in modern Western yoga, but it's actually only a very modern idea. And in the various yoga traditions, there are some schools of thought that say there are 5 chakras, there are some that say 7, there are some that say 9, there are some that say they're in these specific locations, and there's others who say that they're in different locations. There are some traditions that say they extend below the body and above the body and outside the body. These are, the idea of 7 chakras originated in America in the 1920s, I think, and it actually doesn't show up in many, if any, of the traditional yoga texts. They speak of energy centres, but they don't say this is the set number, nor do they necessarily say much about the qualities of them. So the chakras are simply energy centres in the body. And what I want you to consider is that when yoga first came about back in, a couple of thousand years ago, it was basically a revolt against formalised spirituality or formalised religion, where a group of very genuine, very earnest, we could say spiritual seekers, people who wanted to know, who am I, said, well, I shouldn't, if something's real, I should be able to find that answer for myself. I shouldn't have to trust what the priest says or what the minister at church says. I should be able to find God, the universe, the answer to, existence myself. And it came about through a desire for direct experience of our fundamental nature. And one of the things I think that we've tended to lose in our modern world is that understanding that yoga is about direct experience. It's not about reading something in a book and then just trusting what the book tells you. And some of you have heard me say this before, a bit like Socrates used to say, don't trust anything I tell you other than trust the process. So if I say, there are 7 chakras in the body, say, I don't know about that, Steve. I'm going to look into that myself and see what I find. And to give you an example, one of the commonly held beliefs is that, in this modern understanding, which comes from, say, a very limited set of ideas from people not actually seeing that there's a broader yoga tradition. Because as I've said before, most of our Western yoga comes from really one lineage. And there are a huge array of lineages throughout the Eastern world of yoga, of Buddhism, of other direct paths to self-inquiry. And most of us, instead of following seeing that there's that broad background, we've just sort of gotten fixated on the one lineage that got the most advertising, really. It had the best marketing. So one of the most commonly held beliefs is that Manipura Chakra, the abdominal centre, is at the navel. Who's heard that? And yet for me, I know full well, through direct experience, that as it manifests within this body, Manipura Chakra is here, halfway between my navel and my ribs. So you can tell me it's down at the navel, you can tell me till you're blue in the face, but I know through direct experience that for this body, it's here. And so that's, it's a really simple idea, but what I want you to take from that is that you don't need to trust, in fact I don't want you to just rote learn things, to listen to what someone else said, or even worse, listen to what someone else said about what someone else said. Don't get into the Chinese whispers kind of game of yoga. It's not about listening to someone else's experience or someone else's idea. It's a series of tools for you to experience for yourself, directly know within your own body, mind and heart, things that are normally unknown to most people because our focus is normally outward. And so through turning our attention, our senses within, our focus within, we have the opportunity to directly experience these, we could say, subtle levels of energy in the body. And that's what the chakras are. If we break it down, they're energy centres, would be a way to describe it. Prana or chi, or ki, or however you want to say it, is the life force within the body, and there are certain places where it manifests more strongly. But where those positions are, how many of them are, is up for you to figure out for yourself. There might be some universality that we all experience, but ask the question and find the answer for yourself. If you feel that Manipura Chakra, the abdominal centre, is at your navel, awesome. If you feel it's not at your navel, equally awesome, but find out for yourself. And if you find that you feel 7 energy centres in your body, great. If you feel that there's 3, great. If you feel that there's 36, that's also great. It doesn't matter. This is about direct experience. It's not about what someone told you. And so that's one thing, we do talk often, particularly at the end of class. I don't talk about the chakras too much because there's so much misunderstanding around the energetic body, and so much, so just, spilling of other people's second-hand information, that I think it's really important that, from my perspective, I don't want to fill people's head with ideas of what they should feel, what they shouldn't feel, where they should feel it, what something should, what should happen in a certain set of circumstances when they're doing a certain pranayama rhythm, because that to me takes away their own opportunity for direct, spontaneous experience. Because the power of suggestion is incredibly strong. And if I tell you, time and time again that you're going to feel a certain thing in a certain place, then chances are, simply through the power of suggestion, that's what you're going to feel. And I don't want to take away from you the opportunity to have your own direct experience that hasn't been forced upon you by someone planting an idea in your mind. And so that's why I don't talk very much about the energetic body. We talk very, often just about simple things, a focus in the third eye, focus in the heart space. They're two places where most people will have some sense of being able to take their focus or some sense of energy. Can anyone relate to that? I've told some of you before, for me when I first started practicing, and particularly started practicing pranayama and meditation, there was a strong sense of Ajna Chakra, the third eye centre, which pops up in lots of different spiritual traditions, and it's often depicted in Eastern traditions literally as a third eye. But it comes up in Western spirituality as well. So that for me was the first place where I could feel there was some energetic centre in the body. And I remember it had manifested, this sense of, well, I'm not going to go into detail because again, I don't want to take you away from your own experience. But I remember on a long retreat with my teacher, the first long retreat, like a 3-week retreat, and I was lying down in Shavasana at the end of practice, and we were given the instruction to get up, and I went to take the eye bag off my face, and there was no eye bag there. The sensation of Manipura Chakra, of pressure, and not pressure in a bad way, but the sense of tingling of pressure was so profound throughout my whole forehead and across my eyes, I actually thought I had an eye bag on. It wasn't because someone told me you're going to lie down in Shavasana and you're going to feel like you've got an eye bag on. It was something that happened spontaneously. And so for me, I knew that that was a manifestation of prana, of vital energy, of life force in that energetic centre, which for me manifested in that space, in that sort of triangle between the centre of the forehead and the eyebrows. Maybe that's not where you feel it. Maybe you don't feel anything there at all. That's fine. It doesn't matter. Some of us are drawn to the heart space, to a sense of focusing there in meditation, or some sensation in the heart space. So heart and brow are probably, if there's if we could say there's two centres that pop up in pretty much every tradition, they're probably the two. But again, find out for yourself. Maybe some of us have had a sense of energy, pressure, warmth, cold, can be presented in different ways, described in different ways in the heart space. And we don't know why, but maybe we're lying there and we feel, we might feel that, there's that common, the heart is open. Well, what does that mean?
So with the, energy centres, is there any kind of link between that and certain areas of the body that are highly innervated, like nerve plexuses in the body seem to be sometimes correlated to similar areas?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting question, because there does seem to be some correlation between, as you say, neural plexi and some of those energetic centres. I think part of what we try to do in our Western understanding of yoga is we try to find a Western scientific validation for things that perhaps we can't validate, but we know anyway. So, I could say, I have direct experience of Ajna Chakra as an energetic centre. And so in our Western medical mind, or our desire to break everything down to the physical and to often deny the non-physical, we say, oh, that's the pituitary gland, or it's the pineal gland. But I don't think it's really helpful necessarily for us to go down that path. And in the same way we could say, the brachial plexus coming out of the neck, well, that's Vishuddha chakra. Well, Vishuddha chakra doesn't even pop up in a lot of the traditions. We could say the sacral plexus, well, that's Svadhisthana chakra. You could, but is it necessary? Does it change anything? If someone tells me what I felt is my pineal gland being stimulated, does it change?
No, it's still being stimulated anyway, whether you call it whatever.
Yeah, and I think what we need to understand is that, and we've talked about this before, every experience that we have, whether external or internal, is fundamentally happening in the mind. So our nerves feed into the mind, and then we have the mind creates an interpretation of a stimulus based on past experiences. So it tells us, someone is close or is far away based on, our eyes our brain's interpretation of our eyes having light reflected off the retina. When we hear a sound, our brain says that's coming from the left or the right based on the time delay between hearing it in the left ear and the right ear. But it's actually all just happening in the mind. There is no, we can go down this rabbit hole, we have done many times before, but reality is simply a mental construct. There is no fundamental subjective reality of the world. We all see the world and experience the world in our own unique way based on our senses and our mind's interpretation of the world. So what one person sees as a long way away, another person sees as close. Who had that first experience with them when they ever travelled to a really heavily populated country where everyone's really, really close? Anyone? No? Maybe it was just me. See, I grew up in the country, so personal spaces, there was lots of it. And so the first time I went to India, and hi Joe, how you going? Like, that's normal personal space. It was weird. Like, why is everyone so close? Yeah, and they're all going, oh, this is just normal. And this is our reality, or actually our non-reality, our mental construct of reality. It's happening in the mind. So whether we say, an external experience is real because we can say, oh, that's a nerve stimulus, you touched the floor, that's still not any more real than me being asleep and dreaming that I'm touching the floor, where my brain tells me I'm touching the floor. My brain is still saying I'm touching something. The mind is interpreting it as real, but actually there's simply something going on in the brain. So whether there's actually the neural stimulus or not, it's actually the brain that creates our sensation and creates reality. It's not the sense organs themselves, it's actually in the mind. So whether we have an experience of Ajna Chakra and we say that's subtle energetic life force being stimulated in a chakra, or whether we say that's the pineal gland being stimulated, it doesn't matter, because the manifestation of that as a sensation or as an experience is fundamentally just happening in the mind anyway. And I think that's where sometimes, I've said this before, we have this Western idea of if I can't measure it in SI units, it's not real.
There's kind of a need for the mind to rationalise it in
some
way.
And if we take that to its logical conclusion, we could say up until the early 20th century, radiation didn't exist because we didn't have Geiger counters to measure it.
Australia didn't exist until Captain Cook.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Until we had an anemometer or a thermometer, we couldn't measure wind speed or temperature, so therefore temperature variation didn't exist and wind speed didn't vary. Having an instrument to measure something we feel doesn't add or subtract from the experience of it. So when we, let's say, have a genuine experience of something, and all experiences come and go, and again we can say they're unreal, but we don't need to be able to scientifically validate it in order to know that it's real. You know, it's like that, it popped up in my head today, the scene in Pulp Fiction where, is it Vincent and, what's Samuel Jackson's character? Can't remember, it's a long time, 25 years ago that came out, I think. Yeah. Anyway, where the guy empties a revolver at them at close range and misses with every shot. And Samuel Jackson's saying, he's saying it's a miracle, and Vincent Vega's just going, no, it's not a miracle, he just missed. And then Samuel Jackson's character saying, it doesn't matter whether what I experienced, what happened was an according to Hoyle miracle, what matters is that I felt the touch of God. And I want you to understand that that is the way we should approach our deepening yoga practice. It doesn't matter whether it fits the prescribed, the things that we feel, the things that we experience as our practice involves. It doesn't matter whether we can explain them in scientific terms. It doesn't matter whether we can measure them in SI units. We don't need to seek validation from someone else because we know in our own heart that something happened. And even if we can't say why we know anyway. And we talked about this a little bit before, in other satsangs, that knowing happens before the mind gets involved. In each moment, there's a knowing of right action, there's a sense of experiencing, and then almost instantaneously after the experience, after the knowing, the mind comes in and says, you felt this, you thought that, that's what you should do because. But actually the experience or the knowing of right action happened in silence before the mind got involved. And so we don't need to validate something that's deeper than the mind with the mind. It's actually kind of pointless. And it doesn't necessarily serve us. In fact, it often takes us down the path of negating things that are real. No, the temperature didn't vary because I didn't have my thermometer to measure it. Does that make sense? And that, this is a long way of coming around to what I was saying, is that our yoga practice is about direct experience, about feeling certain things, about having certain understandings, about having moments of stillness, of clarity, of connection to a sense of peace that we can't explain, a sense of joy that we can't justify, because we don't need to actually justify them. When we feel the touch of God, we know we feel the touch of God. And I'm using that Samuel Jackson phrase, well, we could say God, we could say the universe, we could say Ma. These are all just different expressions. When we say we dissolved into the oneness, it's just another expression of the same. We all in our lives, and particularly if we deepen our yoga practice and use the tools of asana and pranayama and meditation to start to direct our attention within, we will have moments of insight into the nature of reality, true reality, the nature of what we are and what we're not fundamentally. And we don't need to have someone else validate them. And we don't need to read a textbook and say, oh, did it fit that little checklist of what someone said. That can't have been Manipura Chakra I felt because it was, 7 centimetres too high. We know when we know, and we don't need someone else to validate it for us. Does that make sense? So that's yoga myth number 3. There are 7 chakras. There is an energetic body, but how many chakras there are? Figure it out for yourself. Where they are, figure it out for yourself. And be open to recognizing that you feel something that you can't say what it is, but you know that you felt something more subtle than the mind and the body, let's say. Just to keep it simple, without needing to necessarily validate. And you don't need to buy into the language of, I opened my heart chakra, or I opened all my chakras with this meditation. That's just people who are talking nonsense. If people are using that language, they're generally just sprouting stuff they've heard someone else say, and they actually have no direct experience of what they're talking about. Because people who have direct experiences of the subtle body, of the space before the mind or behind the mind or beneath the mind won't use language like that, because it's actually nonsensical to use language like that. In fact, the only language you can use is to shut up and say nothing, if you're being utterly honest about it. But sometimes it helps to have a little understanding, or let's say some hints as to what you might find. So say, if there is a sense of prana at an energy centre, you might feel a sense of warmth, you might feel a sense of tingling, you might feel a sense of buzzing, you might feel a sense of pressure, but these are just ideas. It might not feel like that at all. But when you know something genuine has happened, you'll know, and you won't need me to tell you. You won't have to come and say, Steve, it was 2 centimetres below where you said. Direct experience. That's what our practice is about. Direct experience of our true nature, of that which is beyond the body and the mind, which we can't explain in scientific terms, but which we nonetheless know is absolutely real. And while we're on the chakras, who knows what the bija mantras are for the chakras? Anyone?
Do we know what they are, or do you want to recite?
You can do either.
No.
So has anyone heard this idea that the chakras have a mantra associated with them?
Yeah.
Ram, yam, hum, om. Okay. Guess what? It's a myth. Yoga myth number 4.
Feels nice talking about it.
So it feels nice doing it. But here's the interesting thing, and Nada and I have talked about this at length before. But in actual fact, the bija mantras, which through the recitation of what other people have told us, we've started to take as universal fact, don't belong to the chakra centers at all. They actually belong to the elements: earth, water, fire, air, ether. So you actually don't have to chant Lam at the base chakra. You can chant it at any of the chakras. And if you want to have a sense of grounding, you could say, and then this is going into mantra yoga, which we don't do a lot of, but Lam is actually the mantra for the earth element, for grounding and stabilising. So, of course, it makes sense sometimes to chant it at the base, but if you're feeling a bit unstable in your heart, if you're feeling a bit emotionally unstable, why not chant it there, in the heart space? Paradoxically, if we're always chanting ether, space, or emptiness in the heart space, no wonder we often feel a bit emotionally unstable, because all we're doing is fixing emptiness in our heart. Maybe it would be good to flip things around a little bit and chant downwards from the heart space.
Doing a handstand?
While doing a handstand, even better. So the text that Nada actually pointed to me talks about how the bija mantras and the elements attached to them are meant to be prescriptive, not descriptive. So this idea of moving up the chakras with a bija mantra shouldn't say always fix this element in this chakra. What it should be saying is, if you want to fix this element in this chakra, this is the mantra you use. Does that make sense? So it's actually saying a medicine. Like if you're having problems here, this is the mantra you use to sort out that problem. If it's an excess of, because again in the Indian systems, or they have the universe is made up of those 5 elements: earth, water, fire, air, ether. So if you have a lack of the water element in the abdominal centre, then chant the mantra for the water element at that space with an intentional mental focus in that space. But it's not meant to be just go up through them, and that's where they always stay. And the other thing that I find quite interesting is that there's 5 elements. Oh, hang on, we've run out of mantras when we get to hear. So what do we do now?
Oh, we're just old.
We're just on.
And then old.
That's right.
Because it can't be the same.
Yeah. So the interesting thing when we talk about chakras is that the Tibetans have always maintained that there's 5 chakras. And Tibetan Buddhism and early yoga actually come from more or less the same root. And I'm not saying this is the right way because, hey, I want you to have direct experience. But I think it's interesting that in the Tibetan system there are 5 chakras that end at the crown, and there's 5 elements. That's a coincidence, isn't it? 5 elements, 5 chakras. They all actually perhaps correspond more closely to a 5 chakra system than they do to a 7 chakra system where we've had to tack on 2 ohms at the end to finish the set. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I want you to understand that those, again, this is talking about the energetic practice a little bit, because some people will be drawn to mantra yoga or to meditation with a mantra. And mantras are just a great way of steadying the mind. I can't remember who it was one of the 20th century Indian saints who said, mantras are really helpful because after saying them for days and days and days at a time, your mind gets so bored with saying the same thing, it just shuts up. So if we, you could say that's maybe the purpose of mantra yoga. All of what we're trying to do is still the mind, to see what exists behind the mind or what exists when the mind is silent. That's our practice of yoga, to break free from the identification with the body and the mind. So we have all these tools that help us to bring the mind to a sense of quiet, so that we can then perhaps look between the gaps to see what there is when the mind is silent, when the mind doesn't exist. So mantra yoga is very beneficial for some people to have a repetitive chant that they use. So if you're drawn to those bija mantras, or if they've been something that you've incorporated, then by all means incorporate them in your practice. But don't rigidly stick to, I must chant the mantras in this order in these locations, because that is just a dogmatic approach that doesn't make sense. Explore and see what works for you. In the same way I talked to you about exploring the asana practice and see what postures work for you. Depending on your physiology, full up dog might not feel great. So lie on your stomach and do bhujangasana. That's fine, doesn't matter. Explore and find out what works for you. As we've discussed many times, with pranayama rhythms, some people will say this is the most important pranayama rhythm, but then someone else from a different tradition will say, no, this is the most important pranayama rhythm. Some people will say Padmasana is the ultimate sitting position. That it's the supreme meditation seat. And then you go and read another old yoga text that tells you, no, Siddhasana is the ultimate meditation seat. Don't be attached to dogma. Experience directly for yourself. Explore what works for you. For me, Padmasana, because I screwed my knees up being over-enthusiastic in my early practice, Padmasana I can't do anymore. Doesn't matter. I can sit comfortably in Sukhasana, cross-legged. I can sit comfortably in Siddhasana, like Joe is. I can sit comfortably in Gomukhasana, and depending on how I'm feeling on any given day, depending on how my body's feeling, I'll pick and choose whatever's most comfortable. Doesn't matter. Remember, the practice is meant to work for us, not the other way around. It should fit us and help us to deepen our sense of awareness, or deepen our inner focus, or refine our inner focus. And if it's not doing that, then it's not serving us. And so we find out a modification of the practice that works better for us. A different pranayama rhythm, a different seat, a different variation of the posture, a different time of day to practice. But we do this through direct experience, through not being attached to what someone told us or what we read in a book. And it's, I've said this to you in past satsangs, that there is a time particularly in the early stages of our practice, where it's helpful to go to some yoga texts and have an understanding of what the practice is generally, what it's about, to have an understanding of some of the different forms of yoga practice. But then we reach a point where we actually know enough, and we should stop reading, and we should stop listening to our 274th podcast. Because actually the mind gets in the way. And I've said this to you before. You cannot think your way out of the mind. It's impossible. You can't think about not thinking. You're just thinking. We cannot understand that which is more subtle than the mind with the mind. So a little bit of understanding of what the practice is and how we should apply it is beneficial, particularly in the early stages of our practice when we're not quite sure what yoga is, what it's about, what different things we can do. Should I do pranayama first? Should I then do asana? Should I do asana first? Then should I do pranayama? It doesn't matter. Understand that they are both tools you can use and then find out for yourself what's the best way to apply them. So have some understanding of what the practices are, but then apply them in a way that serves you, that helps you to find a little bit more mental stillness, that allows you to be more present, that allows you to be less fearful of what the future might bring, or less worried about what happened in the past, or attached to the past. And that's how we deepen our yoga practice. Through direct experience, through application of the tools of asana, pranayama, meditation, mantra, devotion. These are all just different forms of yoga practice in different traditions, but we find what works for us. Does that make sense? Direct experience. That's the whole foundation of yoga. If the divine, if universal consciousness is everywhere, it must surely be in me as well. So why do I need to look outwardly for it when it's right here? In the Judeo-Christian tradition, they talk about the omnipresence of God. Well, if God's omnipresent, why do I need to look for God outwardly? It's within. And how you interpret God, as I say, is entirely up to you. You can see it as the old guy with a white beard sitting on his cloud and his shepherd's crook. That's fine if that works for you. You can see it as Durga riding her tiger over on the picture there, or Kali around the corner with a necklace of skulls. You can see it as the emptiness of universal consciousness. Doesn't matter. You can see it as Buddha. Doesn't matter. You can see it as Christ. Doesn't matter. There is no one image or idea of the divine that can encapsulate the enormity of it, that which is everything. And I'm sorry if that sounds a little obtuse, but again, I mentioned before that there is no language to describe the nature of our true being, which is one with God, which is one with universal consciousness, which is one with the divine in however way you choose to understand that within your own heart and mind. Not because someone told you this is what it is, but because for you that's how it manifests. That's what you're drawn to.
Even if you use them as pointers, eventually going into them, let them, they have to be let go of as well.
They do.
Because it's false.
Yeah. Yeah, so you can use them as because they're limited. If we see, and if we always see God as the goddess, or the divine as goddess, then we're limiting the divine to everything that's feminine. And of course that which is omnipresent can't be limited to that which is only feminine. It must exist in everything. That's both male, female and gender neutral, or gender non-specific. And of course on the flip side, if you only ever see God as a male figure, then you're negating the femininity of all of the manifest world. So whatever image you have that helps you on your initial path, it's a bit like the texts. We have something that calls to us initially, or that we're drawn to, that gives us perhaps a little understanding, that helps steer us in a certain direction. But ultimately we need to let go of that as well. Because every idea also has a limitation. It contains something and it excludes that which it doesn't contain. And that's why I said the only way we could really describe the nature of the divine is to shut up and say nothing. because there's no words to describe it. Or you could keep speaking your entire life and never get even a millionth of a percent of describing it in its fullness. So it's better to shut up. Or just say little things. So we have these little, ideas that we talk about, and we have, in different traditions, we have different deities, different manifestations of what that universal oneness may be, which is, as I mentioned, synonymous with our true nature. We are not separate from whatever we perceive as the divine. And that's why, as I said at the outset, whatever we are seeking, it is already within us. It's simply to come back to the recognition that on a fundamental level, we were always and only will always be that universal consciousness, that divine spark, that goddess, that whatever you want to call it. And through confusion, we've come to think that we're a body and a mind. And so it occurred to me again a month or two ago. We've said many times that the body and the mind are the mechanisms for experiencing the world. So that comes back to that little saying of yours that the divine has come up with a form to allow it to experience itself, or life has come up with a form in which it can experience itself, and that form is you. But what occurred to me is that not only is the body-mind a mechanism of experiencing the world, but it's actually the first part of the world that we experience. Does that make sense? Maybe, maybe not.
Sort of, but not really, yeah.
So as consciousness moves out so this is the idea that comes up in a lot of the old texts, consciousness moves outwardly through the senses to experience the sense objects.
Yeah.
But actually the first thing we experience is our own body and mind.
Yeah.
We experience our own thoughts, we experience our own feelings, our own emotions, and our own physical sensations. So the body is not just the mechanism of experiencing, it is actually the first part of the world that we experience. And once we have a direct seeing of me observing the body and the mind, then it creates, we've talked about this before, that subject-object relationship, or it helps us to fully realise the subject-object relationship where whatever I am is observing, as the subject is observing the object of the body and the mind. The subject and object are not the same, so therefore I cannot be the body and the mind, because I'm observing them. In the same way that I observe the bolster, I'm clearly not the bolster. I'm the observer, the subject, it's the object. And when we have a clear, direct, again it comes back to direct experience, when we have a direct knowing of whatever we are, observing the body and the mind that we thought we were, then suddenly there's an understanding that I'm not the body and the mind. What am I? And so, again, we're drawn deeper within. If I'm not the body and the mind, what am I? Which is the purpose of our yoga practice, to recognise what we're not, so that we can then find what we are.
So when we're, kind of experiencing ourselves as consciousness, is that not an experience then?
Correct. Consciousness experiencing itself is our fundamental nature. But most of us don't experience it often. Some people maybe experience it fleetingly a couple of times in their life and maybe don't realise what it is. As I've said to you before, part of our practice is fine-tuning our alertness, so we start to recognise the moments throughout every day when we are consciousness experiencing as opposed to Stephen experiencing. Those times, those split seconds before the mind moves in to say, I felt the floor, or to say my cup of tea or my cup of coffee. To recognise that in every single experience there is that split second where we as consciousness experience the body-mind experiencing the sense object. where the construct of our body and mind, of Stephen, is not separate from the world in which it exists. And my fundamental nature is not Stephen, because I'm separate from it, observing the body and the mind. Which makes sense to some of you, I know, and makes no sense to some of you, perhaps, and that's absolutely fine. But it's in those moments where, we've talked about it before, in the moments when we are when the body-mind dissolves and we are simply resting in consciousness as consciousness, there's no comment, there's no association, there's no me and my. There's no inner dialogue saying, I saw. There's no, there's no my coffee. There's no, my pants. That happens in the mind in the split second after the experience.
So the mind comes in to qualify.
To qualify and to own and to take possession. And in so doing, to cover over that silent moment of knowing, of directly experiencing in the moment. So our practice is about trying to fine-tune our alertness, to turn our attention within, so that we start to recognise more regularly that there are these constant ongoing moments when we are resting in our fundamental nature of consciousness and simply experiencing. And then there are through the nature of life and through the necessity of living in the world, we then have to re-engage with the body and the mind to go about our day-to-day life, to operate, to function. But we should start to, the more we see those little moments where we are the observer, observing the body and the mind, or observing the experience without any inner dialogue, then the more we start to recognise that that stillness, that silence before the mind moves in, is actually something very, very special. That's actually when we're connected to ourself, to our fundamental nature, to universal consciousness, to the oneness, to Brahman, to Ma, to however you want to describe it. It's not something that it's not something we don't already have. It's something that's an ongoing non-experience within us. Non-experience in the sense that it's not transient. It's simply so subtle that when the mind moves in with thoughts and inner dialogue, then the stillness or the very quiet space of awareness is covered over. And I've mentioned this before, if it helps to think of it, the principle of masking in music, or the way our mind works. So basically we have, in the way our ears work, we have this limited capacity to hear multiple sounds at the same frequency. So basically what happens let's say if there's a sound at 1 kilohertz, which is sort of human vocal range, and there's a really loud sound at 1 kilohertz and a really quiet sound at 1 kilohertz, we actually won't hear the quiet one at all. We'll only hear the loud one. And that's how MP3s work to compress music files. They basically use masking to find the loudest signal at every frequency level, and they completely drop everything else out from below. So MP3s work by masking audio signal. And that's exactly the same way our mind works. Or let's say our experience of life works. When there's the very, very loud inner chatter of the mind, it masks the silence of the witnessing consciousness, or the sense of observing, which is very quiet, very subtle underneath. So unless we're very fine-tuned, because there's people who spend a lot of time, audio engineers and people who, are really into music, who will be able to hear an MP3 and a flat file and tell you straight away that's an MP3, because I can hear the difference. Because through practice, they've fine-tuned their alertness, in this case with their ears, to be able to hear the very, very subtle differences when though when the masking is happening and when it's not. And so in the same way, when we fine-tune our alertness to recognise the consciousness that is underlying and supporting and enfolding and containing every single experience in the mind and of the senses, then we start to recognise that it is an ongoing, ever-present awareness, and that is the only fundamentally changeless part of ourself. The body changes, the mind changes, but we recognise that that sense of consciousness, of simply being, has always been there from the moment we were born, and will be there till the day the body dies. And every single experience happens in that space of consciousness. We recognise a thought happening. We recognise a sensation.
Is that just thought from this past few minutes? Like, then the mind, because that is it's simple, that direct experience. It's a simple thing when you're not stopping. It's so simple that then the mind gets confused. Like, I'm trying to seek God. It can't be that simple.
That's exactly, that is exactly right.
I can be walking along and take a moment, like I know the mind's going off, and I just sit back for a moment and just look up at the trees and just allow, the birds to come in the trees. And then when the mind comes back, it's like that. It's too simple. It's not that. That's not what you're going for.
That is exactly right. And Nisargadatta put it really, it's a slightly different way, but he was Nisargadatta Maharaj was one of the Indian saints who died in the 1980s. Really funny guys. Chain smoked. Owned a couple of beanie shops, like Indian cigarette shops. Very much just a normal looking guy. But he was very clear and very direct with his teachings, and he basically used to say to people, you can come and listen to me for a day or two. If you haven't got any questions, go away, you're wasting my time. And after you've stayed here for 2 or 3 days, go away and practice. There's no point sitting here listening to me more until you apply this for yourself. Really, I think a wonderful way of teaching people, because again, there was that tendency for people to want to just absorb more information rather than applying what they knew. But he said, what's obvious is easily overlooked. And, effectively, that's the translation from Marathi into English, but what's obvious is easily overlooked. What's ever present and subtle is easily overlooked, because it's there all the time. So we just don't notice it. Consciousness is ever present and very subtle, very quiet, very simple. And it's so simple and so subtle and so ever present that we overlook it. And so our practice is actually about helping us to see that which we always overlook. The simplicity of that moment of looking up, seeing the birds and the trees without having to have the mind comment. Just of being completely present in that moment where you are simply experiencing, consciousness experiencing. And that's the nature of the self, our deepest self. And that is universal consciousness, simply experiencing through billions and billions of different life forms, through their own mechanisms of experiencing. And so with our high functioning human intellect, we experience the world in certain ways, but a cow or a horse or a bird also experiences the world through its mechanism of experiencing, through its body mind. And even plants experience the world. They respond to light and heat and water and gravity. They change their growth rates depending on their circumstances. There is a consciousness within them that responds to, that is aware of the world around them. It's just not a high-functioning intellect. But the consciousness is not a high-functioning intellect. It's simple. It's simply awareness, simply experiencing. And that is our fundamental nature, simply consciousness experiencing. And so simple, so subtle, so obvious that it's easily overlooked. It can't be that simple. Surely it can't be that I've always had. Because our association with the body and the mind has become so deeply ingrained through no one's fault, but simply through habit and repetition, that we've started to become enamoured of the body and the mind, of the wonderful things it can do. But in the process, we've forgotten what we actually are. And of course, then we become fearful. Because if we think we're the body and the mind, and as human beings, we suspect that we're the only living creatures that are aware of our own mortality. So as human beings with our high-functioning intellect that tells us, oh shit, you're going to die one day. Whilst we've bought into being the body and the mind, we think it's us that's going to die. And so all of our fears arise from that one simple misassociation. So I may be experiencing the world through the body of Stephen, and at some point this body will pass and dissolve back into its constituent elements. But fundamentally that's not me. Once we break down that association with thinking we're the body and the mind, then there's no birth or death. And Nisargadatta again puts it really well when someone was talking to him about the idea of the death of the body and should we be afraid and should we be upset when a friend dies. And he said when we feel that we're the body, we feel that we're born and we die. And once we realise that we're not the body, then the world simply arises and then dissolves. So when the body is born, the world arises, we have the mechanism to experience it. And when the body dies, the mechanism of experiencing is gone. So we're no longer aware of the world. But the consciousness which was experiencing the world through the body and the mind remains unchanged. And he put it even more, I think hilariously, someone said, but death's a calamity. And he said, it's not dying that's the calamity, it's being born that's the calamity. Being born without awareness of without maintaining an awareness of our fundamental nature. So that we can live life experiencing fully, tasting all the different experiences of living, but without being attached to them, without any fear that at some point we're going to die. Knowing that at some point, we leave the body, or we could say the body leaves us perhaps, but that won't fundamentally change our true nature, which is simply consciousness. It's simply the experiencing that fades, or the experiencing, let's say, through an individual body and mind. But fundamentally we don't change. As long as we think we're a person, then we think we're going to die. And once we know we're not a person, we were never born. The body was born, but I wasn't, because I'm not the body. And that sounds a bit crazy, unless you have a direct experience of knowing that you're not the body. And then once we have that direct experience, we're not fearful anymore. Because the worst that can happen is you can die. Of course, it's not me dying, it's just the body dying. So that's exactly right. The worst that can happen is we return to what we've always been, which we never left. It's the analogy that's sometimes given us, like you have an ocean where every little drop of water thinks it's separate from all the rest. But actually it's all just the same ocean. Not separate, all just part of one greater whole. But through our association with the body-mind and our high-functioning intellect, we've come to think of ourselves as separate little raindrops, or separate little water molecules. And there's a lovely Buddhist analogy that says that the true nature of life is like a river flowing over a waterfall. So at the top of the waterfall, we recognise that we're all one. When the water goes over the cliff, it breaks up into a multitude of droplets, and when it falls into the pool at the bottom, it all merges back into the same river. And that's actually, once we have a deeper understanding, that's the way we see life. We are only ever the river of consciousness. And when we're born into the body, there is a sense of separateness, perhaps, but with intelligence we know that actually all those little droplets that form the rainbow of the waterfall are ultimately just part of the river and will merge straight back into the river when the body dies, when the water reaches the pool at the bottom. So it frees us up to live life without fear, to experience both the highs and lows, the duality of life. As I said, in the manifest world, I promise you there will be equal parts joy and sorrow. That is the nature of duality. It's expressed perfectly in the yin-yang symbol. You know, that I guess you're all pretty familiar with. There's balance of the two. Every bit of light has a little bit of dark, every bit of dark has a little bit of light, but ultimately there is the same amount of light and dark. That's the expression of duality. And in yoga, it's also said that the greatest joy, if we're not alert, the greatest joy in the manifest world will be the cause of greatest sorrow, because once the experience passes, we'll be forever longing for it to come back. And at the same time, the greatest sadnesses will contain the greatest joys, because they have the power to propel us to understand our true nature, or to even push us back into our true nature. You know, negative, I've mentioned it many times before, seemingly negative experiences are often where we touch consciousness most directly, where we touch that mind-free, thought-free space of simply experiencing. But then we don't stay in that space. So once we understand the true nature of who and what we are, we're free to experience the light and dark, the yin and yang, the good and bad, the happy, sad, the like, the dislike, but without any attachment to any of it. We just allow each moment to come to us, to experience it fully, not always chilled, sometimes furious, sometimes laughing like a mad person. But each moment comes and goes and we experience it fully. And overall there's a deeper settling, a sense of peace within each of those moments. Because we understand that the comings and goings of experiences don't change our fundamental nature. The troughs and the peaks of the waves don't change the existence of the ocean. And that's what our practice is about. A series of tools to experience that directly for ourselves. So it doesn't matter if someone tells you you're barking mad, or tries to give you logical arguments about why that can't be right, because it doesn't make any sense for them to try and argue it, because nothing they say can change what you know through direct experience. That simple analogy I've said to you many times before. Once you've eaten a dragon fruit, you know what a dragon fruit tastes like. And someone might say, no you don't. Well, yeah I do. You know. But show me the picture of you eating it. Well, I didn't take a picture. Doesn't matter whether it can be externally validated or not. Once you know, you know. But the challenge is that even after we have moments of clarity, moments of knowing, of direct connection to our deepest self, the mind will still try to drag us into association with it as an individual. And so we need to be constantly alert, constantly attentive to not getting pulled back into that individual identity. Of always coming back to being the observer of the mind and the body experiencing, as opposed to being the body and the mind experiencing. Constant vigilance. It's challenging at first, let's say, to have that level of awareness, of attentiveness. But the more we practice, the more we refine our attention and be aware of our inner dialogue and the space between the thoughts, then the easier it becomes. It's like anything. With repetition, it becomes easier. And there's a saying in one of the old yoga texts that as an asana is perfected when the effort required to do it becomes effortless. And in the same way, we reach a point with our alertness, with our inner focus, that the effort required to do it becomes effortless. Because it's ongoing anyway. We're always just consciousness observing. We're always just witnessing awareness. And the more familiar we become with that space, the easier it is for us to remain simply as the witness, as that consciousness, or as that observer, or however you want to describe it. Just other words to describe something intangible, but which you can directly experience and know for yourself, and which will set you free over the years from all of your fears, and all of your doubts and all of your worries, and which will allow you to be what you have always been, to reconnect with yourself. Still going about your day-to-day life, inhabiting the body, pretending to be a person, but knowing that you're not. And that's all we need to do, is just pay attention, be alert, be attentive, and use the tools of the yoga practice, whichever ones we're drawn to, whichever ones work for us. Asana is a wonderful tool, particularly at the initial part of our practice, because it gets us into the body. I mentioned how the normal tendency of the senses is to be externally focused, to be feeding outwardly, to be, look over there, to be caught up in the flashy external experiencing of the world. And so the practice of asana, with its very strong sensations, initially helps us to keep our awareness within the body, so that we're not worried about what the person next to us is doing. We're not worried about what we're going to do at work tomorrow. We're not worried about dinner or anything else. We're just focused in the body. And then our practice, as I've mentioned to you before, our practice is one of coming from the outer, from a distracted outer focus, to a single-pointed inner focus. So we start by bringing our awareness into the body and the sensations and the activations we need to make that shape. And then we take our awareness further within. What's the breath doing? Now this is the unfolding, or it's not the unfurling, it's the furling of our yoga practice. It's going deeper within. We start with our focus on the body. Then once we have a certain level of refinement of focus on the body, we take our attention to focus on the breath. What's my breath doing when I'm making these shapes which I'm now comfortable with? Can I fine-tune my breath? Can I make it smoother? Can I make it quieter? Can I stretch it out? Can I take it to places where it wasn't moving before? And once we have a certain level of refinement of focus on the breath, then we start to be much more able to recognise what the mind is doing when we're making shapes and breathing. Is the mind focused? Is it steady? Or is it starting to wander off? And when we reach that level of attentiveness, we start to recognise the gaps when there's no mind. The mind being simply the movement of thought. And once we start to recognise that there are gaps when there is no mind, we start to go, okay, so I'm not the mind, what am I? Can I go deeper within? What's the next level of subtlety behind the mind, beneath the mind, below the mind? Not higher. Again, this is the terminology that sort of gets thrown around in the New Age world, higher consciousness, higher mind. It's not higher, it's deeper. It's below, it's within.
You want that open heart state.
So we're fine-tuning our alertness, turning our attention within to the point where we can observe quiet thoughts arising and then dissolving because we're not paying any attention to them. And we recognise the space, the gaps, the stillness, the moments when nothing's happening. And we embrace those moments of stillness, of nothing. And that's very challenging because, of course, when, how many times have we heard, I don't know if you guys did, but as a kid growing up, don't just sit there, go and do something. That's the way we're encouraged in our society. Don't just sit and do nothing. Go and, if you've got nothing to do, pick up your phone and check Instagram. Go and, wash the dishes. Go and call someone, whatever it may be. We're not encouraged to embrace the nothing, the stillness, the gaps. But it's in the gaps, in the stillness, when we have the opportunity, the potential to recognise our true nature, our fundamental self, which is simply consciousness, which experiences through the body and the mind. But we just have to be alert enough, attentive enough to see that which is obvious, that which is subtle and simple and ever present, and so easily overlooked. And that's all. Very simple. But not necessarily easy initially. That said, it does get much easier with practice. And it does leave you in a space where you are much better able to deal with the ups and downs of living manifest life, with a sense of calm and peace, of equanimity, that word that comes up from the Bhagavad Gita, of being equally happy with success or failure. Because you know that fundamentally it doesn't change anything. And that's what our practice calls us to do. And hopefully it calls all of you. I know it certainly does for some of you. I suspect it does for most of you. And if it doesn't, that's okay. Maybe it will further down the track. Maybe it won't. That's out of my hands. But I do firmly believe that all of our problems in our life come from our disconnection from our fundamental nature. And once we reconnect to our fundamental nature, all of the problems of humanity, of society, of the planet that we're on can be resolved. But the root cause of all of them is that we're not connected to our fundamental nature. We don't see what we really are. Simply consciousness. So my wish for all of you is that you will look within and find in that stillness, in those gaps, in that space, what you really are, and hold on to it. As Niskadeva says, stabilise there until that's all that remains. And then there's nothing more to do. And I think that's plenty from me, unless anyone has any specific questions. Thanks very much, folks. Remember, Namaste means the divine light within me recognises the divine light within you. So it's a recognition that our fundamental nature is universal, that beneath our external differences of male, female, old, young, whatever else it may be, our fundamental nature of consciousness is universal. The consciousness within me recognises the consciousness within you and recognises that we are not separate.